In the sweltering heat of Jackson, Mississippi, during the summer of 2013, the air hung thick with the scent of magnolias and the hum of cicadas. Jackson was a city steeped in tradition, where faith was the bedrock of life, and the Bee Haven neighborhood was no exception. Here on these quiet streets lined with oak trees and family homes, tradition and faith were more than just values. They were the lifeblood of the community. At the heart of Bee Haven stood Pastor Samuel Bennett, a towering figure in more ways than one. For over 20 years, Pastor Bennett had been a moral compass for the people of Jackson, a man whose voice resonated through the pews of Mount Zion Baptist Church, leaving a mark on every listener. His sermons, delivered with the fervor of a man possessed by conviction, could soften even the hardest of hearts, pulling people in from all walks of life. To the congregation, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a living example of godliness, a beacon of integrity in an unpredictable world. Mount Zion Baptist Church was more than a building. It was a refuge, a place where hundreds gathered each Sunday seeking hope, answers, and belonging. For many, it was a second home. Under Pastor Bennett's guidance, the church had become a cornerstone of the community, an anchor in times of uncertainty, and an inspiration in times of despair. Outside the church, Samuel Bennett's life appeared to be the very picture of stability and success. He lived just a few blocks away in a stately white clapboard house with his wife, Grace, a woman of quiet resilience, known for her unwavering faith and gentle presence. Together, they had raised two children who were now teenagers, each carrying the weight of the Bennett legacy with pride and respect. To the outside world, the Bennetts were the model family, devout, united, and unshakable. Yet, as so often happens, appearances masked a more complex truth. Behind the closed doors of his study, Pastor Bennett wrestled with inner turmoil that few could have imagined. The weight of his responsibilities, the endless expectations of the congregation, the unrelenting scrutiny, and the demands of being the moral backbone of the community had begun to take their toll. Leadership, once a source of pride, had become a burden. The lines between his public role and private self grew hazy, and Samuel found himself questioning the very foundation of the life he had built. In the solitude of his study, where the walls bore silent witness to his struggles, Samuel faced the churning storm within him. He had spent his life embodying the ideals of discipline and righteousness, yet beneath the surface, a profound restlessness simmered. The pressures of his role and the monotony of a life lived under constant watch were wearing him down, exposing a vulnerability that no one, not his congregation, not even his family, could see. As the heat of that Mississippi summer pressed down, so did the weight of his own secrets that would soon push him to the brink, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long kept buried. It was during this period of quiet turmoil that a new face appeared in Pastor Bennett's life, a young man named Jordan Mitchell. At 23, Jordan had recently arrived in Jackson to attend a nearby university. He was handsome, with an easy charm that seemed to light up any room he entered, and a confidence that belied his age. Charismatic and full of life, Jordan was quickly noticed by many in the congregation at Mount Zion Baptist Church, but no one took note of him more than Pastor Bennett. Jordan began attending services regularly, slipping easily into the rhythm of church life. He volunteered eagerly, helping with community events, youth programs, and any activity that allowed him to be at the center of things. His enthusiasm was infectious, and the congregation embraced him with open arms. To Pastor Bennett, Jordan was initially just another young soul in need of guidance, a promising newcomer who sought purpose and direction. But what started as routine pastoral care began to drift into more complicated territory. In Jordan, Samuel sensed a kindred spirit, a young man full of questions and uncertainties that mirrored some of his own, though separated by decades. Samuel found himself drawn to Jordan's vitality, his optimism, his curiosity. Their conversations after services lingered longer than usual, extending beyond scripture and into deeper, more personal matters. Jordan spoke openly about his struggles, his hopes for the future, his need for acceptance, and his search for meaning. And in turn, Samuel found himself confiding things he had never spoken about to anyone, not even his wife. What neither of them could fully articulate was the magnetic pull growing between them. There was an intensity in their interactions, an unspoken connection that both men felt but dared not name. Their meetings grew more frequent, often lasting late into the night, when the church was silent and empty, cloaked in shadow. There were fleeting touches, a hand on a shoulder that lingered a moment too long, a gaze that held just a bit too much. What should have been guidance was becoming something far more personal, as the line between spiritual mentorship and something deeper, something forbidden, blurred. Jordan admired Samuel's wisdom and authority, but he also sensed the conflict beneath the pastor's composed exterior. He saw the weariness in Samuel's eyes, the hints of vulnerability in his guarded expressions. For Jordan, there was a thrill in this closeness, with a man so revered by the community, a man everyone else saw as untouchable. And yet in private, Samuel was just a man, flawed, searching, and undeniably drawn to him. For Samuel, the connection was intoxicating and unsettling. He was both captivated by Jordan's presence and haunted by the implications of his growing attachment. He tried to rationalize it as a strong pastoral bond, a duty to guide a young man in need. But the lingering glances, the palpable tension between them, made it increasingly difficult to ignore the truth. Samuel knew he was crossing a line, but the thrill of something so out of reach, so beyond the rigid confines of his life, held him captive. With each passing week, the tension between them grew thicker, becoming a silent presence in every conversation, every touch, every look. They both felt it, a powerful, dangerous current that threatened to sweep them beyond what either had intended. And as their connection deepened, Samuel found himself standing on the precipice of a choice that could change everything. As the summer days faded into the amber light of early fall, the relationship between Pastor Bennett and Jordan crossed an irreversible line. What had begun as late-night conversations and lingering glances had evolved into a full-fledged affair, emotional, physical, and undeniable. Their connection, once cloaked in the innocence of mentorship, was now a carefully hidden secret that neither could resist, but both knew could destroy them. Each encounter was a calculated risk, a dangerous dance in the shadows. They met in secluded places around Jackson, quiet parks, empty church rooms, the occasional late-night drive to the outskirts of town. Anywhere they felt safe from the prying eyes of the congregation, and most painfully for Samuel, from the quiet scrutiny of his wife, Grace. She was his anchor, a woman of steadfast faith who had stood by his side for years, supporting his mission and believing in the image of the man he portrayed. Keeping the affair from her was a constant source of guilt, but that guilt only seemed to intensify his desire for Jordan. Pastor Bennett told himself he could manage this double life. In his mind, he was still in control, balancing his public duties as a man of God with the secret cravings of his heart. He rationalized that he deserved this release, this escape from the endless pressures of leadership. Surely he could compartmentalize, fulfilling his role at the pulpit, his responsibilities as a husband and father, while indulging in these fleeting moments of passion. But as the days grew shorter and the leaves began to fall, cracks started to appear in his carefully constructed facade. For Jordan, the affair had lost some of its initial thrill. What began as a powerful connection, almost intoxicating in its secrecy, was now a source of mounting frustration. He felt like a hidden part of Samuel's life, stashed away, only emerging in the cover of night. While he was drawn to Samuel's wisdom and authority, he also resented the hypocrisy, the way Samuel could preach about righteousness and self-restraint by day, only to surrender to forbidden desires by night. Jordan began to see himself less as an equal in this relationship and more as a hidden indulgence, a role that stirred a bitter anger within him. The strain between them simmered, growing more volatile with each meeting. Jordan's dependence on Samuel, a man he admired yet resented, left him feeling trapped, unable to break free yet increasingly resentful of his position in Samuel's life. Samuel's hold on him was suffocating, but so was the thought of losing the only person who seemed to truly see him. For Samuel, the affair had become both a sanctuary and a curse. The thrill was addictive, yet it came with a crushing weight of fear and shame. He knew the stakes. If anyone found out, the life he had spent decades building could unravel in an instant. Still, he told himself he could keep control. He could keep his private life separate, hidden, like a forbidden fruit tucked away just out of sight. But deep down, he sensed the lie in his own reasoning. With each secret meeting, the weight of his choices pressed down on him harder, and the whispers of guilt grew louder. As fall settled over Jackson, the affair teetered on the edge of collapse. The secrecy, the deception, the unspoken resentments, it was all spiraling beyond their grasp, a web of forbidden emotions that could not be contained for much longer. Both men were haunted by the tension between what they wanted and what they feared, and each meeting left them standing closer to the brink. Unseen by the congregation, unnoticed by the world, they were caught in a cycle that was building toward an inevitable breaking point. By the middle of 2014, the tension between Jordan and Pastor Bennett had reached a breaking point. What had once been thrilling and intoxicating had now become bitter and suffocating. Jordan, tired of living in secrecy and resentment, decided he could no longer endure being Samuel's hidden shame. Driven by anger and desperation, he confronted the pastor with a cold ultimatum. Either Samuel publicly acknowledged their relationship, or Jordan would reveal everything himself. For Pastor Bennett, the threat was a nightmare come to life. The thought of exposure, of his congregation, his family, and his community discovering the truth was almost more than he could bear. The very foundation of his life was built on his reputation, his role as a man of faith, and his carefully cultivated image of righteousness. In an effort to buy silence, Samuel offered Jordan money, hoping it might placate him, or at least buy him time to figure out an escape from the trap he found himself in. The first payment was large, a desperate attempt to soothe Jordan's resentment. But coming up with that money wasn't easy. It required dipping into the church's emergency funds, an act that tore at Samuel's conscience, even as he rationalized it as necessary. But the payment only deepened the cracks in their relationship. For Jordan, it wasn't just about money. He wanted recognition, respect, and control over his own life. And with every payment, his bitterness grew, as did his demands. What had started as a plea for acknowledgement soon turned into an ongoing financial drain. Each time Jordan reached out with new demands, Samuel felt his options narrowing. The strain was becoming unbearable. He was forced to juggle deceptions, invent excuses for missing church funds, and keep his spiraling emotions hidden. The facade of control he had once clung to was disintegrating, piece by piece. As Jordan's demands grew more unpredictable, Samuel began to unravel. His guilt, stress, and fear of exposure were crushing him, and the toll became evident in every part of his life. His sermons, once delivered with fire and conviction, grew dull and listless, filled with vague platitudes instead of the passion that had once inspired his congregation. His congregation noticed the shift. The energy in the room felt muted. The once vibrant atmosphere at Mount Zion Baptist now tinged with an unspoken heaviness. Samuel's family, too, sensed something was wrong. At home, he was distant, often retreating to his study for hours, claiming he needed to prepare for sermons or attend to church business. Grace, his ever-patient wife, watched as her husband withdrew further into himself, his once commanding presence dimming under the weight of his secrets. His children, once his pride and joy, began to feel like strangers to him as he struggled to keep up the facade of a loving father while carrying the burden of his betrayal. The strain on Mount Zion Baptist Church grew as well. Congregants whispered among themselves, speculating on what might be troubling their beloved pastor. Attendance slowly declined as the spirit that had once drawn people to Samuel's sermons faded. Longtime members who had once looked to him for guidance now sensed an emptiness in his words, a lifelessness in his eyes that hinted at something dark beneath the surface. Even those closest to Samuel within the church's leadership began to feel uneasy, noticing irregularities in the church's finances and Samuel's erratic behavior. By now, Samuel was barely holding on, caught in a tightening web of lies and deceit. The fear of discovery gnawed at him, a constant weight that left him haunted and hollow. He knew he was losing control of his life, of his family, and of the very community he had dedicated his life to serving. The man who had once stood as a pillar of faith was now on the brink of collapse, with the shadow of his sins closing in around him. And through it all, the chasm between him and Jordan only deepened. What had once connected them, a mix of admiration, desire, and shared vulnerability, had turned into a bitter power struggle. Now their bond was defined by resentment, manipulation, and mutual destruction. Samuel knew that something had to give, but he was terrified of what that might mean. He was a man trapped, unable to escape, yet unable to keep the truth hidden much longer. The once revered pastor, who had spent his life preaching redemption and forgiveness, now stood on the precipice, facing the very real possibility of losing everything he held dear. By October 15, 2014, Pastor Samuel Bennett was a man on the edge, consumed by desperation and fear. The affair, the lies, the mounting blackmail, it had all pushed him to his breaking point. That night, a violent storm rolled over Jackson. The sky split open with flashes of lightning, the thunder rumbling like a warning. Under the cover of the storm, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He arranged to meet Jordan in a remote area just outside the city, a secluded spot hidden by trees and washed in darkness. The pretense was simple: one final payment to end it all. As rain poured down, turning the dirt roads to mud and the night air cold and unforgiving, Samuel stood waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. When Jordan arrived, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Samuel's mind was racing, each beat of his heart a reminder of what he stood to lose. But it wasn't until Jordan began to press him again, demanding more, that something snapped inside Samuel. A moment of sheer panic, with fear and anger swirling like the storm around him, Samuel lashed out. He grabbed a heavy metal object he had concealed, and with a single brutal swing, struck Jordan across the head. The blow was immediate and lethal, and in an instant, the young man who had once filled him with desire and dread lay motionless on the ground, his life extinguished in the rain-soaked mud. Samuel stood frozen, horrified by what he'd done. The reality of his actions sinking in like a stone dropped into dark water. The storm raged on, thunder crashing overhead, masking his whispered prayers for forgiveness. But forgiveness would not come easily. Driven by a primal survival instinct, he moved quickly, dragging Jordan's body deeper into the woods. There, with his hands trembling and the rain mixing with sweat and tears, he dug a shallow grave beneath an ancient oak, bearing not only Jordan's body, but the evidence of their affair, the phone that held every damning message, every trace of their connection. When he was finished, Samuel staggered back to his car, soaked to the bone, his hands caked in mud and blood. The ride home was a blur of flashing headlights, slick roads, and the pounding of his heart. He tried to steady his breathing, to tell himself that it was over, that he had done what he had to do. But deep down, he knew that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. In the days that followed, the weight of his actions bore down on him, crushing him slowly, suffocatingly. The guilt gnawed at his mind, creeping into every moment of his waking life and haunting him in his sleep. He began to see shadows where there were none, feel eyes on him even when he was alone. His paranoia grew, an unrelenting whisper that the truth would eventually claw its way to the surface. To those around him, the change was obvious. Pastor Bennett, once a pillar of strength and composure, was unraveling before their eyes. He became withdrawn, his face drawn and haunted, his eyes hollow. His sermons, once so full of conviction, were now scattered, flat, as though he was speaking through a haze. Grace noticed it too. The distance, the late nights, the haunted expression he carried even at home. She asked him what was wrong, her voice full of quiet worry, but he had no answers to give. The congregation sensed the shift as well. The man they had once seen as untouchable was now a shadow of himself, a flickering light on the edge of extinguishment. Whispers started to circulate among the church members, speculations about the pastor's behavior, his erratic absences, and his hollowed gaze. Some believed he was ill, others whispered about a midlife crisis, but no one could have guessed the depth of the darkness he was hiding. Despite his best efforts to keep up appearances, it was only a matter of time before the cracks widened and the truth began to seep through. The weight of his sin was too great to bear, and the ghosts of his choices haunted him at every turn. The once revered pastor Samuel Bennett was now a man in pieces, held together only by the fraying threads of his own guilt and fear. And as he carried the burden of that terrible night, he knew deep down that his secrets would not stay buried forever. Jordan Mitchell's sudden disappearance did not go unnoticed. His family, alarmed by the silence from their usually attentive son, reported him missing within days. His mother, who had always kept close contact with him, knew something was deeply wrong. Her pleas for answers stirred the Jackson Police Department into action, prompting an investigation that would unravel one of the city's most shocking scandals. The case was assigned to Detective Lisa Morgan, a seasoned investigator known for her relentless pursuit of the truth. She approached Jordan's disappearance with a thoroughness born of years of experience, combing through his last known contacts, habits, and connections. It wasn't long before her inquiries led her to Mount Zion Baptist Church and to Pastor Samuel Bennett. At first, the idea that the revered pastor could be involved seemed far-fetched, but as Detective Morgan delved deeper, disturbing connections began to emerge. Phone records revealed a pattern of late-night calls between Samuel and Jordan, many of them occurring at odd hours. Financial records raised further suspicion, showing unexplained transfers from the church's accounts to Jordan's bank. When she interviewed members of the congregation, some of them reluctantly admitted to noticing a strange closeness between the pastor and the young newcomer. Piece by piece, the evidence mounted, painting a picture that was both shocking and tragic. It became increasingly clear that the relationship between Samuel and Jordan had been far more than pastoral, and that it had ended in violence. By December of 2014, Detective Morgan had gathered enough evidence to arrest Pastor Bennett. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community, leaving congregants and neighbors in disbelief. How could a man who had been their spiritual guide, a figure of trust and authority, be involved in such a sordid affair? The trial began in early 2015 and drew intense media attention from across the nation. The courtroom was packed with journalists, community members, and former congregants, all eager and horrified to hear the details of the case. The prosecution, led by the formidable District Attorney Karen Jackson, presented a compelling and meticulously constructed case. In her opening statement, Jackson did not shy away from the grim details, describing the affair between Pastor Bennett and Jordan as a dangerous entanglement that spiraled out of control, ultimately leading to murder. Evidence of Samuel's guilt was overwhelming. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of the affair, complete with incriminating text messages, phone call logs, and financial transactions that showed the steady flow of hush money from the church's funds to Jordan's account. Witnesses were called to testify, members of the congregation who had noticed the late-night meetings, financial officers who had flagged discrepancies in the church's accounts, and even Jordan's family, who shared their grief and suspicions about his disappearance. Detective Lisa Morgan took the stand as well, walking the jury through the harrowing sequence of events her investigation had uncovered. She detailed the evidence trail that led her to Pastor Bennett, recounting her discovery of the phone records, the suspicious financial transactions, and the final fatal meeting on that stormy October night. Her testimony left little room for doubt, cementing the narrative of a man who had been driven to desperation and violence to protect his secrets. Samuel's defense attempted to paint the incident as a tragic accident, a meeting that turned deadly in a moment of panic. But the jury was unmoved. 3 weeks of testimony and evidence had painted a clear and damning picture of the pastor's actions. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Pastor Samuel Bennett was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift and uncompromising: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once revered pastor, who had spent decades as the spiritual leader of his community, would now spend the rest of his days behind bars, bearing the full weight of his choices. The fallout was devastating for the people of Jackson, Mississippi. The scandal left an indelible scar on the community. Mount Zion Baptist Church, once a beacon of hope and unity, was now fractured, its congregation scattered, and its reputation in ruins. Longtime members who had seen Samuel as a moral leader and friend were left grappling with betrayal, their faith shaken by the revelation of his double life. Attendance dwindled, donations dried up, and the church became a grim reminder of the depths to which one man had fallen. The story of Pastor Samuel Bennett quickly became a cautionary tale, a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked desire, secrecy, and the corrosive effect of a hidden life. His legacy was now a grim shadow, a reminder of how a man who once embodied virtue had succumbed to his darkest impulses, taking an innocent life in the process. In Jackson, his name became synonymous with scandal and hypocrisy, a tragic fall from grace that would haunt the community for years to come. For those who had trusted him, who had looked to him as a symbol of righteousness, the shock was profound. And for the family of Jordan Mitchell, the trial and conviction offered a grim closure, but no true solace. They had lost a son, a brother, a friend, in a senseless act of violence that would forever change their lives. As the courthouse emptied and the cameras left town, the people of Jackson were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered faith. And in the quiet moments, in the empty pews of Mount Zion Baptist, a heavy silence lingered, a testament to the price of secrets and the lives they destroy.